You ever notice how much we hear about needing to stay positive all the time?
Like it's the only acceptable way to live.
Yeah, avoid all discomfort, right? Every headline, every influencer, everyone's pushing this good vibes only kind of life. But is that really realistic? I mean, is that even what a good life is?
What? And is it even possible, right?
Exactly. So today we are diving deep into a book that takes a very different stance.
Different how?
It's called The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Feck by Mark Manson.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that. Isn't it kind of counterintuitive?
Totally. And that's what makes it so interesting, right? It flips the script on this whole always be happy narrative.
So what does he say instead?
Well, the book basically argues that this constant chasing of good feelings and this avoidance of anything that might be painful, it can actually make you feel more empty in the long run.
Huh. That is counterintuitive. But it also kind of makes sense.
All right, and we're going to get into all that.
Yeah.
How embracing struggle, setting better values, learning to accept failure even.
Yeah.
These are all things that Manson says actually create real growth and meaning.
Yeah, we've looked at a lot of sources on well-being on this show, and a lot of them sort of touch on those ideas in different ways, but Manson just straight up challenges the typical self-help approach.
Absolutely. Okay, so to kick things off, there's this story in the book about Charles Bukowski.
The writer.
Yep. Now, this was a guy who openly called himself a loser, like he owned that label.
Sounds a bit rough.
Yeah, well, but here's the thing. He ended up becoming a very successful writer. And you want to know what his tombstone says?
I'm intrigued. Tell me.
Don't try.
Wow.
Don't try. That's a statement.
And Manson uses that to illustrate this idea that Bukowski didn't buy into the whole strive for more mentality that we're always bombarded with. He just accepted himself, flaws and all, and he was super honest about those things in his writing. And it resonated with people.
It's almost like he transcended that pressure to be something he wasn't by not trying. Exactly.
Yeah.
Which, again, is the opposite of what we're usually told. It's all about better job, bigger house, perfect partner, constantly striving for this idealized version of ourselves.
And that can be exhausting, that constant pressure.
Totally. And, Manson says that kind of thinking can actually trap us in what he calls the feedback loop from hell.
That sounds unpleasant.
Oh, it is. It's basically that thing where you feel bad about something and then you beat yourself up for feeling bad. Like you get anxious and then you start freaking out about being anxious.
Well, yeah, I've definitely been there. It just makes everything so much worse.
Right. And the key insight here is that it's often our reaction to a negative feeling, not the feeling itself, that really causes the most suffering.
So not giving effect, then, is about, just ignoring those feelings?
That's a really important point. Because, it's not about being apathetic or just not caring about anything. That's not what Manson means.
Yeah, that wouldn't be very helpful.
Right. He's talking about making a deliberate choice about where you direct your energy and your attention. Like figuring out what actually matters to you, what's worth your mental and emotional real estate, and then consciously deciding what you're not going to give a feck about.
So it's more about being selective.
Exactly. Accepting that, yeah, there are going to be negative feelings. They're part of life.
But not letting them dictate your whole experience.
Yep. Kind of like the weather, right? It's rainy outside.
You don't yell at the clouds to make them go away.
Exactly. You'd grab an umbrella.
Makes sense. So this idea of choosing what we give a fuck about, how does that relate to this idea of embracing struggle and problems, that sort of thing?
Oh, that's a great transition. Because that's actually a huge part of Manson's argument. He says that problems and suffering are actually valuable, even necessary parts of life.
Okay. How so? Doesn't sound very appealing.
Right. It's not about seeking out pain for the sake of it. But he tells this story about a prince who was obsessed with finding enlightenment.
Enlightenment through suffering, like that whole aesthetic thing?
Yep, exactly. Gave up all his wealth, lived in poverty, like the whole 9 yards.
So did it work? Did he reach enlightenment?
Well, he eventually realized that just suffering for the sake of suffering was pointless. Like that there was no inherent value in it. He was missing something.
Which was?
Purpose. Manson's point is that pain in and of itself doesn't do anything for you. It's what you learn from it, the problems you overcome, the growth that comes out of it that really matters.
So it's about finding meaning in the struggle.
Exactly. And it reminded me of that concept of the disappointment panda. Have you heard of that?
Rings a bell. Refresh my memory.
It's basically this idea that life is just a series of problems, one after another, and that happiness comes from solving those problems, not from avoiding them.
Oh, right. So we have to engage with the problems, not just try to pretend they don't exist.
Exactly. And the disappointment panda is like this blunt, honest friend who tells you straight up what the problem is. No sugarcoating.
So where do negative emotions fit into all this? I mean, they don't exactly feel like a good thing.
Well, that's where it gets interesting. Manson says that those negative emotions actually serve a really important purpose.
Oh, like what?
They're like signals, like alarm bells going off inside you. They tell you that something's wrong.
Okay, I can see that. Like a warning sign.
Right. Like if you're feeling anxious, it might mean you need to reassess a situation. Or if you're feeling angry, maybe there's a boundary you need to set.
Instead of just trying to force ourselves to feel happy all the time.
Exactly. Because when we do that, when we try to suppress those negative emotions, we're actually stopping ourselves from addressing the root of the problem.
So it's almost like those negative emotions are trying to guide us.
They are. And Manson also talks about how everything in life involves some kind of sacrifice. Like there's always going to be a potential downside.
Give me an example.
Well, like the joy of having a close relationship also comes with the risk of heartbreak. Or the excitement of starting a new business comes with the potential for it to fail.
Right. You can't have one without the other, really.
Exactly. And true fulfillment, according to Manson, isn't about trying to avoid those negative aspects. It's about learning how to deal with the whole spectrum of human experience, the good and the bad.
Embracing the whole package.
Yeah. And that's where that question he asks comes in. What pain are you willing to sustain? Because he says the struggles we choose to face are often the ones that give our lives meaning.
What pain am I willing to sustain? It really makes you think.
It does. It forces you to decide what really matters to you, what you're willing to fight for. Okay, so now I want to get into this whole trap of entitlement and this obsession with feeling good all the time.
Yeah, let's go there.
So Manson talks about this guy named Jimmy, who's this like perpetually positive startup founder, but Jimmy never actually accomplishes anything. He's all talk. But he still somehow feels amazing about himself. Do you know anyone like that?
Oh gosh, too many. Lots of Jimmys out there.
Right. And Manson argues that real self-worth isn't about feeling good all the time. It's about how we feel about the not-so-good parts of ourselves, and if we're willing to work on those parts.
So Jimmy, with all his forced positivity, he's actually avoiding real self-reflection.
Totally. And by doing that, he's preventing himself from actually growing.
It's like he's built this wall of good vibes to protect himself from any kind of real self-awareness.
Exactly. And that's where entitlement comes in. Because if you constantly believe that you deserve good things without having to put in the work, then anytime something bad happens, you just blame someone else or call it bad luck. You never have to look inward.
It becomes impossible to learn from mistakes that way.
Exactly. And, Manson even talks about how he used to be pretty entitled in his relationships. And he traces that back to some unresolved pain from his childhood.
That makes sense. It's like that unaddressed pain can manifest as entitlement.
Yeah, almost like a defense mechanism. And then he goes on to connect this rise of entitlement to what he calls the tyranny of exceptionalism, which is basically this idea that we're constantly bombarded with images of extreme success and happiness thanks to, the media and social media.
Oh, for sure. Like everyone's got to be a millionaire influencer with a perfect life, or you're just a failure.
Right. And it creates these unrealistic expectations. It makes us feel like we're not good enough if we're not living those perfectly curated lives.
Which then feeds that sense of entitlement because we feel like we deserve that level of success and happiness, even if it's completely unattainable.
Yep. And he uses a really powerful story to illustrate this. It's about Hiru Onoda. Do you know about him?
It sounds vaguely familiar. Remind me.
He was this Japanese soldier who was stationed on a remote island during World War II. And he refused to believe the war was over.
Wait, seriously?
For decades. Like he stayed hidden in the jungle for like 30 years because he thought the war was still going on.
Oh my God. That's intense.
It is. And he was eventually found by this Japanese adventurer, Norio Suzuki. And the whole story is about how Onoda had constructed this entire reality in his head, and he was completely unwilling to accept any evidence that contradicted it.
So it's like an extreme example of clinging to a belief even when it's no longer serving you.
Exactly. And it really highlights this danger of getting so caught up in our own narratives that we become blind to reality. Okay, so that brings us to this whole idea of reevaluating our values and taking responsibility for our lives.
Yeah, okay. So how do we do that?
Well, Manson says that our values basically determine what we choose to give a feck about. And that if we choose poor values, then we're going to have poor problems.
Makes sense. Give me an example.
So if your main value is, say, being popular or getting approval from everyone, then you're going to constantly worry about what other people think of you. And that's going to create all kinds of problems based on insecurity and fear of rejection.
Right, because you're basing your self-worth on something external that you can't really control.
Exactly. And Manson talks about how he had this big conflict with his brother because they were both musicians, but his brother was more successful.
Oh, that's got to be tough.
It was.
Yeah.
And he realized that he had chosen a really poor metric for his value as a musician. He was measuring his worth by comparing himself to his brother, which was never going to end well.
So he had to reevaluate what actually mattered to him.
Yep. And then he talks about the difference between Dave Mustaine and Pete Best. Have you heard of them?
Mustaine, Metallica, right?
Yep. He was the original guitarist for Metallica, but he got kicked out before they got huge.
And he's still pretty bitter about it, if I remember correctly.
Oh, he is. He's made a career out of being bitter.
And what about Pete Best?
He was the drummer for the Beatles, but he got replaced by Ringo Starr, like right before they hit it big.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I'd forgotten about that. So he was in the Beatles, but...
just missed out on the fame and fortune.
Ouch.
Right. But here's the thing. Best ended up being totally fine with it. He moved on. He had a happy life. He doesn't seem to harbor any resentment.
Interesting. So what's Manson's point?
That Mustaine based his worth on this external measure of success. Like, he measured his value as a musician by how famous and rich he was compared to Metallica. And that created a lifetime of suffering for him.
Right, because he was always going to fall short in his own mind.
Exactly. But Best, on the other hand, eventually reevaluated his values. He found happiness outside of that specific definition of success.
And that made all the difference.
Yep. And Manson connects this to the idea that the difference between a painful problem and a powerful problem often comes down to choice and responsibility.
Choosing your battles, I guess you could say.
Exactly. Like, if you feel trapped in a situation, that's going to feel way more painful than if you feel like you have some agency.
Right, even if the situation itself is the same.
Yep. And he talks about William James, the philosopher.
Oh, I know him. Wrote about pragmatism, right?
Yep. And James had all kinds of health problems. He was pretty miserable for a lot of his life.
So how did he deal with that?
Well, he eventually realized that he couldn't control the fact that he was sick, but what he could control was his reaction to it.
So he took responsibility for his own emotional experience.
Exactly. And that changed everything for him. He found a way to be happy even though his circumstances were difficult.
That's powerful.
It is. And this all relates back to that idea of responsibility versus fault. Like, Manson tells this story about a bad breakup he went through. And he says, yeah, his girlfriend was at fault for how she acted.
Okay.
But he realized that while she was responsible for her actions, he was responsible for his own healing process.
So it wasn't about blaming her.
Right. It was about acknowledging that even though someone else might have caused you pain, you are ultimately responsible for how you move forward.
For how you process that pain.
Exactly. Okay. Now I want to get into this whole thing about embracing uncertainty and failure, because Manson makes a pretty bold statement here. He says certainty is actually the enemy of growth.
Wow. Really? I mean, certainty usually feels pretty good, right? Like knowing what's going on.
Sure. But he says that when we become too attached to our beliefs, when we refuse to even consider that we might be wrong, it stops us from learning and evolving.
We get stuck in our ways.
Yep. And then he describes this really fascinating experiment. It's called the button pushing experiment.
Never heard of it. What's that?
So basically, they bring people into a room, and there's this computer with a button. And the participants are told that if they press the button, they'll get a little electric shock.
Okay, so not exactly fun.
Right. But then they're also told that there's a pattern to the shocks. Like, if they press the button in a certain sequence, they can avoid getting shocked.
Got it.
And so the participants start pushing the button, trying to figure out the pattern. But here's the thing. There is no pattern. The shocks are completely random.
Oh, so it was a trick.
It was. But here's the crazy part. Even though there was no pattern, the participants started to convince themselves they'd figured it out.
Wait, seriously?
Yeah, like they'd come up with these elaborate theories about the order they had to push the buttons to avoid the shock. And they were totally convinced they were right.
Even though it was all in their heads?
Exactly. And Manson uses this to show how our brains are wired to look for patterns and meaning, even when there isn't any. And once we believe something, we tend to filter out any information that contradicts that belief.
You see what we want to see.
Yep. And he even talks about how our memories aren't as reliable as we think they are. Like, we can actually rewrite our memories to fit our current beliefs.
That's kind of scary.
It is. And he uses this story about a woman named Meredith who recovered these repressed memories of being abused.
Recovered memories. That can be tricky territory, right?
Totally. Because in Meredith's case, it turned out that those memories weren't real. Like they were implanted by her therapist.
Oh, wow. So she believes something that never actually happened.
Yeah. And Manson's point is that we have to be really careful about becoming too attached to our own stories, especially when those stories involve pain and trauma. Because sometimes our desire for certainty can lead us down a very dangerous path.
So what's the antidote to that?
Humility, like being willing to admit that we might be wrong, being open to new information, even if it challenges our beliefs. He also talks about this woman named Erin, who is a total self-improvement junkie.
Self-improvement junkie?
Yeah, like she was constantly reading self-help books, going to seminars, trying to optimize every aspect of her life, but she never actually made any real progress.
Because she was so focused on following the rules that she never actually looked inward.
Exactly. And Manson uses her story to show how even the pursuit of positivity and self-improvement can become a form of avoidance if it's not based on genuine self-awareness. Like, true growth often starts with acknowledging what we don't know.
Okay, so we've got to be willing to question everything, including our own beliefs.
Exactly. And that includes questioning our fear of failure.
Oh, right. Because if we're constantly trying to avoid failure, we're never going to take any risks.
Exactly. And Manson actually talks about how failure can be a good thing. Like he tells about how he graduated college during the Great Recession.
Oh, yeah. That was a tough time.
It was. And he sees that as kind of a fortunate failure.
Fortunate failure? How so?
Because there was so much uncertainty and chaos, the stakes felt really low. Like no one expected to land their dream job right out of college, so he felt free to experiment, to try different things, to fail, and learn from those failures.
Because there was less pressure.
Exactly. And that freedom to fail actually led him to discover what he really wanted to do.
I see that.
And he connects that to the failure-success paradox. Like, he uses the example of Picasso.
Oh, yeah, the painter. He was super prolific.
Super prolific. And Manson says it's because Picasso focused on the process of creation rather than on achieving some specific outcome.
He wasn't fixated on the end goal.
Right, like his main value was honest expression. And he just kept creating, whether his work was successful or not. And that constant practice, that willingness to experiment and fail, ultimately led to his success.
So it's about enjoying the journey, not just focusing on the destination.
Yep. And then there's this research by Kazimierz Dabrowski. He studied survivors of World War II and found that those who went through the most intense negative experiences often came out of it with incredible psychological growth and resilience.
Wow. So trauma can actually lead to positive transformation.
It can. And Manson says that it's because those experiences force us to confront our own mortality, our own vulnerability. And that confrontation can actually be liberating.
But how do we get from that intense negative experience to that positive transformation?
That's a great question. And part of it is about understanding that action often precedes motivation.
What do you mean?
It means that sometimes you just have to start doing something, even if you don't feel like it. Like if you're feeling stuck or paralyzed by fear, just taking a small step, any step, can actually create the motivation you need to keep going.
I see. It's like you have to prime the pump a little bit.
Exactly. And Manson calls these really simple actions that we avoid because of fear VCR questions.
VCR questions. That's a random name.
I know, right? But think about it. Back in the day when everyone had VCRs, programming them was a nightmare. Like it was a super simple task that felt impossibly complicated.
Right, all those buttons and settings.
Exactly. And Manson uses that as a metaphor for those things in our lives that we avoid because they seem overwhelming, even though they're really not that difficult. Like asking someone out on a date or applying for a new job. They can feel like huge obstacles when we're afraid of failing.
So we get stuck in inaction.
Yep. And his point is that we often overthink things, making them way more complicated than they need to be. And that the best way to overcome that is to just start doing something.
Just take that first step.
Exactly. And he also talks about how chasing superficial highs, like excessive travel or partying, doesn't lead to lasting happiness. Like he went through a phase where he was traveling all the time, trying to escape his problem.
Yeah, it didn't work.
Nope. Because he was running away from himself. He wasn't actually addressing the things that were making him unhappy. And then he contrasts that with his experience living in Russia, where the culture is very blunt and honest.
Well, yeah, I've heard they don't sugarcoat things.
Not at all. And at first, he was really put off by it.
Oh.
But then he realized that this honesty, this willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, actually created a really strong sense of connection and freedom.
Because everyone was just being real.
Yep. And it taught him that sometimes facing rejection, facing those uncomfortable truths, can actually be more liberating than trying to avoid them. Okay, so the last thing I want to touch on is the importance of saying no and setting boundaries.
Okay, yeah, that's a big one.
Huge. And Manson says that choosing what we value means rejecting everything else. So we have to get comfortable with saying no to other people, to opportunities, even to our own desires sometimes.
Because we can't have it all.
Exactly. And he uses this really funny example. He talks about Romeo and Juliet.
The ultimate love story.
Right. But he presents it in this totally sarcastic way. Like, he's basically saying that this whole idea of this grand, all-consuming love where you're willing to die for each other, it's not actually romantic. It's unhealthy.
Okay, I can see that.
Because it's based on this idea of escaping from your problems rather than dealing with them. Like, Romeo and Juliet are so focused on each other that they ignore everything else going on around them.
And it ends tragically.
It does. And Manson's point is that true love, healthy love, is about supporting each other through your individual struggles, not using each other as a crutch.
So it's about having your own life, your own goals, your own problems even.
Exactly. And that's where boundaries come in. He says healthy relationships have strong boundaries. It means there's a clear understanding of who's responsible for what. Like, you're responsible for your own happiness, your partner's responsible for theirs. You support each other, but you don't try to fix each other.
Right. And what about unhealthy relationships?
Those kind of have really blurry boundaries. Like, people are constantly taking on each other's problems or expecting their partner to solve their problems for them.
And that can get messy fast.
It does. And he talks about these classic roles that people fall into.
Sure.
The victim and the savior.
Oh, yeah. I've definitely seen that dynamic play out.
Right. And it's all based on this lack of boundaries. And he also says that rebuilding trust after it's been broken takes more than just an apology.
More than just saying, I'm sorry.
Exactly. You have to acknowledge the values that led to that betrayal and then demonstrate through your actions that you've changed.
So it's about proving it through consistent behavior.
Yep. And finally, he touches on this idea called the paradox of choice, which is this idea that having too many options can actually make us less happy.
How so?
Because we're constantly worried about making the wrong choice. Like, what if there's something better out there? And it makes it harder to commit to anything.
Right, because we're always second-guessing ourselves.
Exactly. And Manson argues that commitment is actually essential for experiencing real depth and reward in life.
Because it allows us to focus our energy and attention.
Yep. And he shares how he actually found a greater sense of freedom and liberation by committing to certain relationships, certain career goals, and certain values.
Like he created his own structure.
He did. And it freed him from that constant feeling of needing to keep all his options open.
Yeah.
Okay, so to wrap things up, I want to talk about this really profound part of the book where Manson talks about his own experience with death.
Oh, wow. Okay.
He had a friend, Josh, who died very suddenly, and it really shook him. Like, it made him reevaluate everything.
I bet.
And he talks about how facing death, whether it's our own or someone else's, has a way of clarifying what truly matters in life. Like, all the superficial stuff just falls away.
Makes you realize what's really important.
Yeah, exactly. And he introduces this concept from Ernest Becker, who is a cultural anthropologist, called death terror.
Death terror? What's that?
It's basically this idea that a lot of our anxieties and motivations stem from this unconscious fear of our own mortality. And that we create these immortality projects to try to cope with that fear.
The immortality projects.
Yeah, like our values, our achievements, the things we leave behind. We're trying to create a legacy, something that will outlast us.
So I can feel like we're not just going to disappear when we die.
Exactly. And Manson says that this is where that idea of not giving a feck comes full circle.
Explain that.
He says that truly embracing the impermanence of life, accepting that we're all going to die someday, can actually free us from that grip of entitlement and that need to create these grand legacies.
Wow. So it's about making peace with death.
Yep. And Becker actually came to realize later in his life that these immortality projects can sometimes be the problem. Like, we become so focused on achieving them that we forget to actually live.
We miss the point entirely.
We do. And Manson talks about this experience he had where he was standing on the edge of a cliff just looking out at the vastness of everything.
Oh, wow.
And he says that in that moment, all of his worries, all of his anxieties just seemed to disappear.
He had a moment of clarity.
He did. Because he was confronted with his own mortality in a very visceral way. And it made him realize that all those superficial things he was chasing, they didn't actually matter.
It put things into perspective.
It did. And ultimately, he says that true greatness isn't about achieving some external measure of success. It's about continuing to choose what we give a feck about, even in the face of uncertainty and death.
Making conscious choices about what matter.
Exactly. And the most profound lesson he learned from his friend Josh's death was that there is nothing to be afraid of, ever.
That's a bold statement.
It is. But when you really think about it, if we can accept our own mortality, if we can make peace with the fact that we're all going to die someday, then everything else becomes a little less scary, a little less heavy.
It frees us to live more fully.
Exactly. So after this deep dive into Manson's work, here's the takeaway. Avoiding pain and chasing constant positivity, it's just not a sustainable way to live. Real growth, real meaning comes from embracing the struggles, from setting better values, from taking responsibility for our choices and reactions, from accepting failure as part of the process, and from facing those uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the world around us.
It's not about feeling good all the time. It's about finding meaning in what matters, even when it's difficult.
Exactly. And it's about making those conscious choices about where we direct our energy, choosing our battles wisely, and investing our fucks in things that truly align with our deepest values.
The things that give our lives purpose.
Exactly. So, as a final thought for you, what's one thing in your life that you've been avoiding? Something that feels uncomfortable or even painful to confront? What if that thing actually holds the key to unlocking greater meaning and growth for you?
Think about the values you're living by right now and the struggles you might need to embrace to truly flourish.
What pain are you willing to sustain to create a life that matters?
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Until next time.